Hi, and welcome to this webinar. This is Graham Clark. I'm the founder and CEO of Breakthrough Filters. I was the host on this webinar recorded on May 5th, 2017. I hope that you're able to learn a few things on this one. So without any further introduction, I'm going to go ahead and let the live recording take over. Have fun. Okay, so welcome guys. Tonight I'm going to go over long exposure fundamentals. Basically, if you guys are wanting to get into long exposure, if you don't know how it works, if you're experienced, then this is kind of for everybody. I'm going to be covering a lot of basic stuff, and I'm going to be covering some advanced stuff. So first of all, thanks so much for all of you guys being here. I know you guys have busy days, and I'm excited to be here with you guys. And thanks for paying the $7. You know, it's for World Wildlife Fund. Before I got on, I donated it to the World Wildlife Fund. So it's great to be able to do something like this with you guys, and then also, you know, give it back to the WWF because those guys do really good work. So we gave $525. Great. So anyways, thanks guys for being here. So this is the flow of tonight here for the next hour. And I'm going to try to keep it to an hour because I know you guys are really busy. So I'm going to go through the bodies, the lenses. I'm going to spend most of the time in exposure, and then I'm going to talk just briefly about hardware. I'm only going to do the bodies and lenses because a lot of people are asking me about this, and it's important to have the right equipment. So bodies. First of all, there's a couple different considerations for bodies, and by a couple, I mean two, when it comes to long exposure photography. The first one is going to be wide angle. A lot of the times we're shooting wide angle, maybe 80% of the time or more. And so full frame really has the advantage here just with shooting at lenses at their native focal lengths. And the second is ISO 50, which I'm not going to talk about right now because I'm going to get into how ISO 50 comes into play during exposure. But this is pretty much it. These are the two reasons why you want full frame. Now, the camera manufacturers, of course, they have this laundry list of features as to, you know, why you'd want to do that. But for us, it's just two. It's just these two. That's it. So I want to convey a really important point with you guys about high ISO and how important it is for ND and for long exposure. So high ISO determines live view brightness for composing. What does this mean? It's a little bit harder to explain than it is to show you. So let me just show you. This is what a scene looks like when you look through the viewfinder, okay? Let's just assume this is just, you're looking through the viewfinder on a telephoto lens and this is what you see with no filter at all. When you put an ND filter on, of course, this is what you see, you know? So you're looking at a scene and you can barely see anything at all. We're all familiar with this, right? Okay, so the Canon 5D Mark II had live view. It was the first camera to have live view. It had ISO 25,000. And for the first time, we could actually, with long exposure photography and ND filters, see the scene rendered very well with ISO 25,000. So let me go back real quick. This is what it looks like when you look through the viewfinder with high ISO of 25,000. This is what it looks like. Now look at this. This is what it looks like with the 5D Mark III because it has 102,000. And the 6D is the same. Okay, so we're never going to be shooting on anything other than ISO 100, but do you guys understand how the high ISO determines how you see on live view? Okay, it's important to realize this because a lot of people have cameras that have low ISOs and they can't see with the ND filters and they can't compose, and this is a problem. So of the cameras that I would recommend, these are the four big ones. And of course, this list would not be complete without the Canon 5DSR. And I just want to talk about this one just for a sec because I was one of the first people to buy this camera, and it has a beautiful sensor. And you would think that this is a great camera for long exposure photography, but check this out. If we go back to our example with the Canon 5D Mark II, which was the first camera to ever have live view, 25,600, this is what it looks like. This is the Canon 6D. And now this is the Canon 5DSR. So because of its low highest ISO, we just can't use this for long exposure photography. What a shame, considering it's such a great camera. But this is a really important point. So this one's just sort of a no-go. Okay, so between these two, you know, a lot of people here, I'd say about 25% of the people on this are probably looking for cameras. So for you guys, what I'd recommend is either of these two. I really like the Sonys using the Canon lenses, but that's just a personal preference. the Canon's built like a tank, but it has light leak, which I'm going to show you about in a sec. And the Sony, on the other hand, it's built like a device and it's kind of fragile, but it works with any lens. But again, the most important thing here, and the reason why these cameras, these are the ones that I'm recommending, is the high ISO is within the range for what we're doing in long exposure photography. So this is a typical setup. This is one of my typical setups when I'm shooting. So this is what my setup looks like. And the most important thing here is that lens cloth there. And without that lens cloth, we're going to encounter an issue with light leak, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But anyways, I just wanted to show you a little bit of what the setups look like when a long exposure setup is engaged. Now notice here in this photo how the Optec strap is over the viewfinder. That's because I'm putting a lens cloth over the viewfinder, but if I didn't put something like my hand over it, then it would just blow away. So the camera strap is what I usually use with the Canon setups. Not very, it's not the cleanest way to go, but it gets the job done great and you don't have to hold the camera. This is another one. So again, anything that you can have in your back pocket, in my back left pocket, that's usually where I keep this just out of habit. So what I'd recommend is that if you use a Canon or a Nikon, then get a lens cloth and put it in your back left pocket and just kind of make it automatic. That's what I'd recommend. Now, another thing about this is that notice here on this camera, there is no lens cloth. That's because on these little Sony cameras, there's no light leak. Okay, so that's another advantage of having one of those Sony cameras. So for those of you who are in the 25% who are really looking for a good setup, this is what I'd recommend. And then I'm going to jump to the next topic. I don't want to stay on this stuff for too long. But the Sony A7 series and the Canon 16 and 35 f4IS, pretty much it's as sharp as a wide angle is going to get anytime in the near future. I have virtually all the lenses out there, and this is the sharpest ultra wide angle lens. And I think it's really good because it was designed for that 5DSR, that great camera that is useless, unfortunately. But anyways, they designed this lens for that great sensor, so the optics are really good. And then you have the Sony, and I just kind of wanted to talk about this for a sec. We've kind of gotten to the point to where even if there's a new feature for these cameras, it doesn't really affect us very much. So in a sense, we're at a point now where we're kind of future-proof. We have 4K video, we have 42 megapixels, we have a lens which doesn't, get soft on the corners. There's virtually zero chromatic aberration. So if there's an update, what's it going to have that's any better? So we're kind of at that point. So this is actually really good because they don't need to keep jumping between systems. So now, I'm confident that you can just get a system like this, and just 5 to 10 years, you're just good to go. All right. So this is another little setup of the camera I wanted to show you. And also, just before we jump off of cameras, there's a lot of different shutter release cables, and you're going to need one for long exposure because we need to go over 30 seconds. And I wouldn't do the ones on your phone or the wireless ones. Now, I've used those and I have those, but really the wired ones are just so great because they're just so mechanically predictable and they just work, And so I just recommend getting a wired one. Now, very important, we can't continue doing, or you can't do long exposure unless you do these steps right here. You have to turn off exposure simulation for Canon, which is enabled by default. If you don't, then when you put an ND filter on, it's going to look really dark. Okay? And for Nikon, you can't turn off exposure simulation, or at least if you can, I don't know how. So you have to just take you just have to take the aperture and run it all the way down to the lowest F number to make it bright and increase the ISO. And you got to do this manually. Not such a good situation with Nikon. The defaults for exposure simulation being off are there for Sony, so out of the box, you don't have to do anything. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because some of you guys don't have these settings off, and it's going to hold you back. And so in any case, make sure to write this down, and if you're not sure, send me an email and we can make sure. Okay, let's talk quickly about lenses, because this is a really important one. Lenses for long exposure. There's a lot of different lenses, and typically we're going to be between 16 and 24 millimeter, and the two factors that are really important for landscape photography and for long exposure are two things: corner sharpness and chromatic aberration. so similar to the camera, it's the full frame and the weight. Here it's the corner sharpness and chromatic aberration. So 15 millimeters and wider, you're kind of handicapped because these lenses, they jump up to being super heavy, and the sharpness on the corners is not quite as good because there's a lot of distortion. And I own all the 14 to 24s and 11 to 24s, and they're beautifully crafted lenses, and they're great. And I like using them in certain situations, but for landscape and long exposure, it's not so good because what it does is that it increases your kit size and your kit weight. They're great lenses and I love them, but for doing what we're going to do, needing to be mobile and run around and all the time, not so good. So I'd kind of stay away from these. Plus, if you're going to do filters, you got to use 150 millimeter or 180 millimeter filters in the case of the 11 to 24. And it just adds a whole ton of weight. So there's some downsides to using the 15s. And also, when you are at, say, 14 millimeters and you apply profile corrections, which we need to do in Lightroom anyways, otherwise the lines aren't straight, it really makes it 16 millimeters anyways. And when you're shooting at 15, you enable profile corrections, it does 17. So the advantage of them kind of dissipates when we do profile corrections. And, so that there's some downsides there, but they are nice lenses. Now, there's two different types of lenses for long exposure, or two different types of lenses. For long exposure, for us, light on the f4 side is going to be better. And typically, the f4 is going to be a little bit sharper, at least on the Canon lenses, which are pretty darn sharp. The f4 versions, for whatever reason, I don't exactly know why, it's explained over at thedigitalpicture.com, they tend to resolve a little bit sharper. And for landscape, that's important. Now, also, one quick thing, there's kind of a hack, or like a kind of a cheat sheet for the best lenses for landscape. And those lenses, I should have put it up here, but I didn't. They're called, Canon has an approved list of lenses for their Canon 5DSR. Basically what happened is Canon made this 50 megapixel sensor with a completely useless camera around it, like I mentioned. And they found that most of their lenses, when they put them on, they were surprised because the resolution of the lenses were bad on this huge sensor. So they created a new line of lenses. And those lenses are the best ones for landscape right now because they're built for this beautiful sensor. Again, you can't use it on the beautiful camera, but you can get around it by using that Sony setup. Okay, so now let's jump into technique. Now this is a great quote. The critically sharp and true color saturation qualities are not innate abilities of the pro. They simply learn more techniques of the trade and then apply them. So that's what I'm about to show you. I'm going to show you those really simple techniques, and the important thing is to write them all down and to understand how they work and apply them in succession. And if you miss one of these techniques that I'm going to share with you, the chain just breaks down. And that's why this long exposure stuff is so tricky. It's not because these steps are so difficult. It's that not everybody knows every step. And even if they did, they don't connect them all. Okay. And that's what this quote basically means. So in any case, you need to learn all these techniques, and you might know them already, but it doesn't matter if you know them and you don't apply them. You have to apply them in succession. So let's jump into them. Now, before we get started, I just want to sort of preface it with what kind of equipment I'm going to be using to talk about these examples. So this is my setup. I have a backpack, a camera, a 16 to 35, a shutter release physical cable, 2 G&D filters, which I'm going to talk about in a bit, and 1 6-stop ND and a tripod. And also, I didn't put it in here, but a 3-stop. That's it. There's nothing else. And all of this looks like this. So, and this is pretty much it. I didn't, talk anything about the tripods, but it doesn't really matter. You can even use a cheap one. But this is pretty much the entire setup, and that all fits into one of these guys, except for the tripod. So we're not talking about too much equipment here, okay? So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about exposure. So to talk about long exposure photography, we got to know a little bit about dynamic range and when to use G&Ds and when not to use G&Ds. G&Ds are pretty much essential for long exposure photography because of this reason, because of dynamic range. So I'm just going to show you a few quick examples. And by the way, I'm sure most of you guys know what a stop is, but a stop is simply a measurement of light. So 1 stop corresponds to a doubling of light. So 1 stop, 2 stop, 2 stop is just double the amount of light. 3 stop, so forth and so on. So this is the top one. This is what we see. So do you see in the lower right where it says 22? This means that you and I see 22 stops. That's what we see. So when we're sitting at a sunset scene without our camera, just looking at it, we're looking at it with 22 stops of range, basically. And if we have to squint our eyes, then the sunset is beyond 22 stops. Okay? Digital camera has somewhere between 11 and 14. You know, Canon somewhere around like 12 or something, and the Sony sensors, and Sony makes Nikon, is around 14. And interestingly enough, it doesn't matter that there's a difference there, and I'll tell you why later. But in any case, human vision is 22, the digital camera is somewhere around 12, but the sunset is anywhere between like, I don't know, 15 and 20, somewhere in there. Let's just say for the example here, it's like 18 stops, okay? So the way that we control that, so notice that there's this gap there, right? The digital camera is sitting there at 12 and the sunrise is up at 18. So the reason why that the camera has a white sky and the ground is perfectly fine is because of that gap right there. So what we need to do is we need to control the dynamic range and close the gap. So we can close that gap by using graduated neutral density filters, not with HDR, because if we do HDR, we can cover the gap, but we're dealing with multiple frames, and most importantly, we're losing the long exposure component. Now you could do one frame with long exposure, but now the whole, but you're still losing a whole bunch of time, and time is basically of the essence. So we don't want to mess around. So this is the way it works. When you apply a G&D to the digital camera, it literally adds dynamic range. Okay? So it literally just, I guess, bridges the gap is sort of a way to think about it. So bridging that dynamic range gap is done with the G&D. So if you put on a 2-stop, then that's not enough. If you put a 3-stop on, then we go kind of further than the sunset. That's what we want to do. It's better to go a little bit further or a little bit under, but not too much further, not too much under. So I'm just going to show you some examples of what kinds of images do you need to have G&Ds. So this one, we don't need a G&D, you know, it's only 13 stops. Okay. 13 stops is within the camera's range. Now, in this case, I took this with the Canon 5D original. I think it was 12 stops is what that camera had, but 13, it's okay. There's still some room. I mean, the camera has like 1 or 2 stops of latitude, anything beyond that. And it just kind of, it's just too far. Similar to film. Film had 1 or 2 stops of push and pull as well. Okay, here, you know, I had an ND on, but it's only 10 stops, so well within the dynamic range. Don't need one. Here, definitely need one because it's 19 stops. You know, here, the sky is so much brighter than the foreground, so now we're seeing 19 stops range. Here, 13 stops, even though it's very bright, the whole thing is bright. So there's not very much shadows in here, so, you know, don't need a G&D for this one. Again, on this one, 12 stops. Now on this one, it's like over 20 stops. I mean, this one I used a whole bunch of G&Ds. I think I used 2, 3 stops, and it was not even enough because you can see that there's some loss of detail there. Maybe I could have gone even higher. Okay, on this one, there was 18 stops. The foreground's actually pretty dark. The sky is really bright. So hopefully you guys are getting a sense for what kinds of images need G&Ds and which kinds of images don't. On this one, don't need one. 12 stops. 13 stops, it's getting close. 19 stops, 14 stops, don't need a G&D on this one, 14 stops, 13 stops. Okay, so those are just some examples of when you should use G&D and when you shouldn't, based on kind of what the scene should look like. Now, light leak is a huge problem with long exposure photography, big problem. And, you know, as a filter manufacturer, we got a lot of people emailing us saying, hey, my filter's broken. And believe me, it's a very common problem. It's not the filter, it's the light leak. And basically, the light leaks through the viewfinder, okay? And what happens is that small amount of light leaks through there. And, you know, these camera designers, they don't design the cameras with long exposure in mind in any, you know, aspect of design. And so light just naturally leaks through there over time. So, you know, this is an example. Doug Ridgway over at the Stockton Photo Club. Thanks, Doug. I don't know if you're on right now, but thank you very much. Doug sent me these examples. So basically, this is what it looks like when you're shooting at 30 seconds. And then notice here on the lower quadrants of the image how it's a little bit lighter. You see that? That's the start of light leak. And then as we go further in exposure, I think this is like 2 minutes. And then I forget what this is. I think this was like, how many minutes was this, Doug? Something like 20 minutes. But in any case, this is what it looks like when you don't cover the viewfinder. And what happens is that the saturation of the image gets lessened because there's less contrast, because that light leak, 32 minutes. Thanks, Doug. So the light leak comes in and it just messes up the contrast. So again, this is what we need. We need a lens cloth there right over the viewfinder, and we need to make sure it's covered every single time. It's a pain in the ass, let me tell you, but you know, you're going to get used to it, but you just have to make sure you do that. Okay. Now, similar to this, another common problem with long exposure is direct light on the front lens element. Now take a look at this and look at the black center there. Look at the black circular thing right in the middle for like 5 seconds, just to sort of focus your attention in the middle. And now look around the scene a little bit to get a sense. Now watch this. In less than 2 minutes after taking this photo, the sun will come up. Look at the difference there. So this difference occurs because sun is hitting the front lens element. Anytime sun does that, it will have this effect. It's a huge difference, and it's night and day. And so you want to make sure that you're not only shooting when the sun's not up and direct, because for long exposure photography, it's really great when you have a lot of color and the sun's below the thing, but below the horizon. But you also want to make sure sun's not hitting the actual lens element. You got to make sure. Very important. Okay, so let's jump into like the setup of what you need to shoot. We already understand what kind of body we need. We already understand what lens we need. So this is what I use in terms of filters. 6-stop ND filter is the most common one, but also the 3-stop, and I'll show you why both soon. If you don't have one and you need one, and you're just going to do one, if you have ISO 50, get a 3-stop. If you don't have ISO 50, get a 6-stop. And then the other two filters I use are a 2-stop soft G&D and a 3-stop hard reverse G&D. This is what it looks like. And this is it. There's no other filters. Typically speaking, this is all you're going to need for doing this stuff. And it's a pretty light and small setup. Now, just to sort of go back to everything, you know, if I were to include the other setup, you know, not including the tripod and tripod head, this is pretty much the totality of the stuff that we need. And then you see that case in the lower right-hand corner. All this stuff fits nicely into there, except of course for the camera and the lens. So not too much stuff. So we're gonna talk about some examples here in the next few slides. And so just keep in mind this equipment when I talk about these examples. And again, very important. It should all fit all this stuff into a small backpack. You know, I host a lot of meetups in San Francisco, and I can't tell you how many people bring a whole bunch of stuff. And that's fine if you're okay with lugging all that stuff around, but you need to be mobile for doing this stuff. And so I recommend a very small backpack. It doesn't have to be a camera backpack either. Okay, so first of all, low ISO is super critical. And the ISO that we're never going to stray from is ISO 100. So ISO 100 is so critical for a number of reasons. Number one, the dynamic range of ISO 100 is the highest. And number two, the saturation is so much better at ISO 100. As you go down in ISO, as you go up in ISOs, the quality gets really bad for long exposure. And long exposure multiplies these effects like no other form of photography. Maybe astrophotography, but again, that's also, in a lot of cases, long exposure. Okay, so low ISO is where we're just gonna stay in ISO 100. We're never gonna go above ISO 100. Occasionally we're gonna use ISO 50, but you know, ISO 50, there's no such thing. It really is ISO 100. It's similar how in the film days, how you could push and pull film. Well, on a digital camera, ISO 50 is really 100 pulled. Okay, so for the F numbers, we're just gonna stick between F16 and F22. And we're not really going to stray outside of this. Now, F22, by the way, just ignore F22 because unless you're using an ultra sharp, ultra wide angle lens like the 16 to 35 F4, F22 resolves kind of a little bit soft, especially on the corners. On the 16 to 35 F4, somehow they've managed to get it so it's really sharp. But what I'd recommend is staying somewhere within f16, f18, and f20. And these parameters are going to give you the best sharpness. And they're also going to help us when it comes to long exposure, because as the higher the f number becomes, the longer the exposure becomes. So this is another way to look at it. As we go beyond the 14 to 20 range, it goes yellow, and yellow is kind of, red would be bad, and then yellow is kind of getting there. So at least for doing wide angle, long exposure photography, you just want to stick between f14 and f20. Okay, now a longer exposure, of course, means 30 seconds or more. What we're going to go over and what I'm going to show you how to do is how to get between 2 and 4 minutes, which is really, I think, the crux of this sunset long exposure photography. In my experience, the best images come from this between 2 and 4 minutes. And so that's what we're going to go. That's what we're going to go for. So again, low ISO plus high F number plus long exposure. And then once you have all this stuff down and once you understand how to control it all, it's basically, you don't even think about it, and it just, all these little variables become kind of one thing. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple examples of what it looks like with and without G&Ds to give you a sense for what G&Ds actually do. Remember that example of when I was talking about how the dynamic range between our eyes is 22? And the camera is somewhere between 12 and 14, we need to bridge the gap there. And so this is what it looks like when you shoot with just a circular ND filter. Okay, just a circular ND filter. Notice how the sky is completely, there's just no detail there, but there is in the foreground. Now, when we add a 3-stop hard reverse, notice how much detail comes into the sky, right? And then as I apply a 2-stop on the front of that, it comes into a more clear focus. This is, I was there and this is kind of what it looks like. So this is pretty much, let me go back here. This is what it looks like with no G&D. And then if we add a 3-stop hard reverse and a 2-stop soft. So this is what it looks like when you increase the dynamic range in camera. And when you're looking through the viewfinder or on the LCD screen, it looks just like this too. So, this is what the camera sees, and that's what the image looks like. So this particular image was 2 minutes, and the 2 minutes looks like this, okay? So when you get to the 2-minute mark, this is what the water does. And if you focus properly, and I'm going to show you guys how to do that later because that's a really important one, it just looks beautiful when you have this really sharp foreground. And again, this is also a property of the high F numbers. If we use a low F number, some detail in this whole range is not going to be in focus unless we're using like maybe 24 millimeters and we're standing further back. But this was a very, very wide angle. I think this was like 18 millimeters or something like that, maybe 20. And so we have to be up near like F18 in order to get this full from front to back sharpness. Now, ISO 50. What does ISO 50 do? When we look into the shadow details here, the shadow details should be noiseless, essentially. They shouldn't have much noise. And here we're looking at almost no noise. So that's the ISO 50. This is what ISO 50 looks like. And then, okay, so 20 millimeters on this one and F18. And again, this is how we can get the critical sharpness. And I'm going to show you how to get critical sharpness in a bit. But when you do these critical sharpness steps that I'm going to show you, this is what it looks like. So in total, we use a 6-stop ND on this, 2-stop soft G&D, and a 3-stop hard reverse. So I'm going to share with you guys kind of a secret trick on how to determine exposure. There's a lot of people trying to use like ND calculators. There's a lot of filter companies who used to provide like ND cheat sheets and stuff like that. You don't want to do any of that. Don't do that. Just rip it all up. And if you have one of those, a lot of people even have them in their bags or something. You just want to get rid of it because it throws people off. They're not reliable because the shooting situations always change. The light's always different. Nothing's ever that constant to have something, in a book like that. I wish it was. Otherwise, it would be very, very easy. But there's a trick that I've learned, and I want to share it with you guys. So a few things before I show you. First, never use manual mode for long exposure. If you're less than 30 seconds, just use aperture priority and push it up 1 EV on the exposure compensation. You want to do this because the camera, it's not really I guess, aware of long exposure. The cameras don't really think about it too much. And they're not really set up for long exposure. So you have to kind of give it a little bit more light than you normally would in order for the exposure to be somewhat correct. And if you're over 30 seconds, we're just going to use bulb, which is essentially aperture priority mode. It's just you choose the time, but it's essentially, it functions very similar. Now, this is how to determine exposure. And write this down. If you guys have books, on notebooks, write this down, because this is really, really cool, and it's going to help you guys a lot if you guys are struggling with how to get perfect exposures. Now, let's say that we're at ISO 100. And you know how when you're at an ISO 100, okay, sorry. I was just looking to make sure everybody was still on. Are you guys still on? Can you guys say something in the chat to make sure everybody's still good? Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, so let me just back up here. So this is the exposure. This is the exposure hack, I guess we'll just call it. So let's just assume that we're at ISO 100 and we're on bulb, and we're on, sorry. So let's say we're on bulb mode, and bulb mode allows us to choose our own exposure. Okay, so in order to determine the exposure, we're going to use the onboard image processor computer on the camera to help us to do the exposure. This is how it's done. You switch from bulb mode to aperture priority mode. Okay, when you do that at ISO 100, aperture priority mode is going to start blinking. It's going to say, nope, won't do it because we're only limited to 30 seconds. And why is it the cameras are limited to 30 seconds? I have no idea, but this is what happens. So you're ISO 100, it turns to 30 seconds. This is what you do. You go up to ISO 200, okay? And it's still blinking at 30 seconds. So you write that down, 1, 2, and then you go up to ISO 400, and it's still blinking, okay? So that's how many times? That's the third time. And then you go up again to ISO 800, and now it stops blinking, okay? Now it's at 25. So the computer tells you that at ISO 800, it can meter this at 25 seconds. So then what you do is you take that 4 and you multiply it by the 30 seconds, and you get 120 seconds. Now we're in the right ballpark, but this is not quite right, okay? In order to make it even more accurate, what we need to do, and again, this is sunset, so the light is falling. So during sunset, the light falls, so we're actually losing light. Every single second that goes by, we're losing light. So what we need to do is we need to add about 20 seconds to account for that 1 plus EV that we would have done if we could do it on aperture priority. Okay, and if you take the image and it looks too dark, then bump it up to 40 seconds. Okay, so take that same number and we'll bump it up to 40 seconds. And then, so every time you do this, you have to go from bulb mode to aperture to do this calculation, and then you just go back to bulb. Okay, they're right next to each other on the dial. So again, just to take a look at this, we do 30 seconds, multiplied out 120 seconds. And then what I would do is I would just add 20 seconds to account for that light loss, and you get 104 seconds. That's your exposure. And that's where you want to start, okay? And then once you do that exposure, you're going to get kind of bearings on if it's too dark or too bright. And you're usually going to be a little bit too dark. So you're going to add more time. So again, you're going to add 40 in additional to the 120. So that's 160. But remember, it's very important to remember in long exposure, it's nearly impossible to overexpose if you do it the way I just showed you how. And so you need to push really far. So you need to don't be too conservative with the amount of seconds that you put on there. It's okay to go too far, but it's not okay to go too few. Now, I'm gonna take questions about that one if you guys have questions about that one at the end. But I want to talk about the power of ISO 50, and this is why the full frame cameras are so critical. Because what you can do is you can take those calculations that I just showed you, these ones, and then what you do is you just multiply it out by 2. Okay, so you take that 160 seconds and you just double that when you go to ISO 50. And that's what's so awesome about ISO 50 is that you can take those exposure calculations and get a good calculation on ISO 100, and then you just multiply it and go down to ISO 50. So again, you just take ISO 100 and you double it. And then what I would do is I would add 30 seconds in between exposures when you do 50. And the reason why is because, and this, again, this is 30 seconds in addition to the 40 seconds from before. So I guess it's total 50 seconds. an easy way to remember that is just ISO 50, add 50. The reason why you want to add 50 as opposed to 20 or 40, or even more than 50, is because the duration of the exposure is twice as long. And so therefore, if the light is falling, you're going to need to compensate even more. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a really cool, it took me a little bit to build this together and to try to think of a way to describe it, because unless you guys are with me right now and I'm showing you, it's a little bit hard to explain it, but follow along with me here. So let's just assume that the sunset is at 6 p.m., okay? It's at 6 p.m., and let's just say our settings are f18 at 20 millimeters. So at about 5:30, I'm going to put ISO 50 and a 6-stop ND on the camera, and it's going to make 1 minute, okay? Again, if I go to bulb mode, I'm going to do 1 minute. And again, I know to do this because I go to aperture priority mode, and ISO 100 says it's okay. Basically, it's just okay. You know, it's blinking and then it goes to 25 and it's blinking and it's going to 25. So then you just, if it's okay on ISO 100, you can just take that 30 seconds if that's okay, and then go down to ISO 50 and then just double it to 1 minute. Does that make sense? And then add maybe 5 to 10 seconds because it's still pretty bright at this point. Now, at about sunset, the light starts to drop off very, very quickly because the sun goes down below the horizon. So let's just assume for a minute that we're at ISO 50 using a 6-stop ND, and now our exposure time, the correct exposure time, jumps up to 4 minutes, again, because the light's falling so quickly. Now, this is what happens. The exposure range is between 2 and 4 minutes. This is the ideal exposure range that we want to be in. And I don't want to talk about why you don't want to go above 4 minutes, but in brief, like the ISO just doesn't work and you get pixel noise and you lose a whole bunch of time. But I mean, for sunset, you can go beyond 4 minutes, but it's better to stay between 2 and 4 minutes in my opinion. So basically at ISO 50, at 4 minutes, we're too far. So what you can do is you can go down to, you can drop it from 50 to 100, and now you go back down to 2 minutes. Okay, and then as the light falls, this is what happens. You can go from 2 minutes at ISO 100 up to 4 minutes gradually. Okay, so you can go from 2 minutes, and as the light falls, you gradually go up to 4 minutes. And then once you get to that limit of 4 minutes, this is what you do. You take off the 6-stop and you put on a 3-stop and you go back down to 2 minutes at ISO 100. You got it? And then once you're at 3-stop with 2 minutes, it's again, the light's going to continue to fall. So you're going to get up to about 4 minutes at ISO 100. And then what you can do is you can go down with no ND filter at ISO 50 for 2 minutes. And then you can just keep going with no filter. And that's kind of the way it works. And, you know, when I'm shooting, and by the way, this is for sunset, but let's assume we're going out and it's for sunrise. Well, picture this in reverse, okay? Starting from the right, on the very far right, we're going to start shooting for the sunrise with no filter. And we're going to start out at probably 2 to 4 minutes, you know? And then as it starts to get too bright, we're just going to kind of reverse this direction. So again, this is what the setup looks like. This is on the left-hand side, the circular ND filters are used for pushing the exposure out. And on the right-hand side, these filters, the G&D filters, are designed to bridge the gap. So the camera sensor can actually see the sunset. Now, it's worth talking about how to get critically sharp images because, you know, a beautiful long exposure shot that's not sharp, you know, it somehow lacks something. So in any case, this is how you do it. A lot of people take the filter off and then they focus and then they put it on, or they do autofocus or something. Don't do any of that. Don't do that. All you do is 3 simple steps. Number 1, set the lens to manual focus. Step number 2, you live view focus at 100%. And then you manually focus. Now, it's important to remember that you have to repeat this process. Sorry, just number 2 and number 3. Every single time you change the focal length. Every single time you change the focal length, you have to do this. So just keep that in mind. And so you're repeating these steps over and over. Now, it's important to mention that the higher the sensor resolution on the camera, the easier it is to get critical sharpness because the 100% magnification is just that much larger. So one of the, I guess, benefits to having a larger sensor could be it's easier to get critical sharpness, to zero in. two cameras, identical lenses, the one that has a bigger sensor is probably going to get more critically sharp images on a consistent basis because it can jump into the scene that much further. Okay, so I'm just going to talk really quick about hardware. And by really quick, I mean one slide, because the most important thing when it comes to hardware is to get a screen which has 4K. And the reason why you want to get 4K, if you don't have 4K, you got to go out and you got to get one. And they're not too much, like a Dell display at 4K is not going to cost too much. But the reason why you just got to do it is because the displays now have a higher resolution almost, or even in some cases, than the printed page. And so if you want to be printing images, or if you want to do anything serious with editing your images, you got to be able to see what it looks like on the output. So anyways, 4K display is what I would say for that. Okay, so that's pretty much what I got for you guys. And I know that it's kind of quick, but I did want to get through everything and be able to take questions with you guys. Now, unfortunately, the audio on this thing has a 20-second delay. It usually doesn't, but for some reason today it does. Maybe my internet connection is slow or something. So if you guys have questions, we can try it if you guys ask in the chat and I can sort of talk about it. Doug has a question. I'm a bit confused about the 5DR. If you're using ISO 50 or ISO 100, does it make a difference? Okay, yeah. So Doug is asking, why does it matter that the highest ISO of the Canon 5DSR, or any camera for that matter, actually matters? Well, let me show you real quick. The most important thing to realize about the camera is that the ISO that we're going to shoot on should never be anything other than 100 or 50, ever. It should never be anything different. But unfortunately, so this is what it looks like if you look through the viewfinder and you don't have any ND filter at all, okay? You just look through the viewfinder, it looks normal. If you put an ND filter on, it looks like this, okay? Now, in order for live view to make this scene right here that we're looking at look brighter, it uses the ISO, the onboard ISO of the image processor inside the camera. It's not doing it with anything else other than the ISO. Okay, so we're not shooting on that ISO, but notice here how the 5D Mark II, it's not very bright, but it's bright enough to kind of see. That's what 25,000 looks like. And then 102,000 is what the Canon 5D Mark III looks like, you see? So do you see the difference there between these two? That's what the difference between ISO means, okay? And so so now when we go back to this original 5DSR, the 5DSR, actually, what's really interesting is that the Canon 5D Mark III has a Digic 5 Plus processor, and that's what gives us that ISO 102,000. Now, the Canon 5DSR has a Digic 6 processor. Technically, it can go up to ISO 200,000, but Canon, through the software, has limited it to ISO 12,000. Now, why didn't Canon limit the software, or sorry, limit the shooting ISO to 12,000? Fine, that's perfectly fine. But allow us to do live view at the highest ISO? You see, they're different. Shooting ISO and live view ISO, it's still using the same ISO, but it's for two different things. So Canon completely shot themselves in the face on this one because they didn't allow us to do live view ISO at the native capability of the camera, which is ISO 200,000. So in short, this camera is useless for long exposure photography. To prove it, just go ahead and try putting on an ND filter onto the 5DSR and go to live view, and you'll see what I mean. Very unfortunate situation, but that's the situation we're in. So yeah, so hopefully that answers it, Doug. If it doesn't, then email me and we can talk about that. Yeah, Dan, good question. Dan says, when you change live view ISO, so when you do live view, the camera's automatically going up to ISO 200,000, or sorry, 100,000 for the purpose of displaying the image on the screen, on the LCD screen. So you're not doing anything with the ISO. Your ISO is set to 100, but when you do the live view, like what's happening internally in the camera is that the processor is really hot and it's using all of its battery power because it's cranking its CPUs on increasing the ISO just for the purpose of viewing it on live view. So again, the shooting ISO is 100. That's fine. It's the live view ISO. If your camera has a low, high ISO, you got to get rid of the camera and get one that's 100,000 or more. Okay, so how do you use a circular and a GND filter? William just asked. It's very, very important how to use ND filters and GNDs. A lot of people, they try to hold the GNDs, and in some situations, holding the GND is okay. But what you really want to do is you want to get a really solid setup so when you put the tripod over your shoulder, this ND plus holder plus GND combination isn't going to fall off. In other words, you can walk over rocks and it's going to be okay. In order to get this kind of setup, what I would recommend is a circular ND. You put the circular ND over the camera. I'll show you guys here. So that circular ND right there, it goes in front of the lens and then the holder goes onto that. Now, a lot of people use square ND filters, and square ND filters are great. I mean, you know, we make a whole bunch of them at Breakthrough, and we're making a whole bunch of them right now. And I've used them in the past, but the problem is that there's always a little bit of light leak, and there's always ways to get around it, doing gaskets and, you know, making the holder in such a way to where there's minimal light leak. But still, when it comes down to it, the circular filters have how much light leak? Approximately 0%. Okay. And they're also very solid. And so when you put the circular ND filter on the end of the lens and then you put the GND combination on that, it just has a really good solid feel. Whereas if you're bumping up and down rocks, you know, who knows? Maybe that square ND can pop out of there. So yeah, in any case, that's what I'd recommend. If you're getting into this, what I'd recommend is get a circular ND and start with that. And you use step-up rings for other lenses if you want. So yeah, so why use the GND? This is actually really, really important. This one slide about the dynamic range. And by the way, we need them because of this right here. GNDs are necessary because the human vision's at 22, the sun sets at 18, the camera's stuck at 12 to 14. And the problem with this is the original Canon 5D, the original. You guys remember that one? I remember buying that thing years ago, and I don't know, over a decade ago. That first full frame camera had a dynamic range, I think, of 11.6. We'll have to check the numbers. Now, the new Canon 5D SR, it's an engineering marvel. The dynamic range on that's about 12. Okay, why is it the dynamic range is not increasing? I don't know. I don't know the technical aspects of sensor manufacturing. For whatever reason, they're not increasing. Once they do increase to like the 18 to 20 range, we can just do away with GNDs. We can just get rid of them. And I can stop making them. You guys can stop buying them. And life will be so much easier. You know what I mean? But I don't see that happening anytime soon because, you know, if in 15 years Canon, you know, gets to like a half a stop more, then there's something underlying here. And in any case, this is why we got to use these GNDs like this. So hopefully that answers your question of, you know, why use the GND? And we're using the GNDs only in the situations where the dynamic range is too great, where there's that gap in between what we see and what the scene is and what the camera the dynamic range bandwidth, I guess. Okay. Dan asked if the Canon 5D Mark IV is good for long exposure. Any camera that has a high ISO of 100,000 or more is going to be good. All right. And interestingly enough, the Canon 5D Mark IV has the same sensor as the Canon 5D SR, or vice versa. It's the same. But again, Canon shot us and themselves, you know, basically in the head here on this one because they've limited us in the software from being able to use the 5D SR for long exposure. Okay, Denise asked about applying the GND filter effect in post. Very good question. So, you know, applying the GND filter effect in the post, you won't be able to get back to where the original detail was. In other words, the detail is going to be lost. And the reason why the detail is lost is because it was never captured in the first place. Okay? It was never captured in the first place because this gap here is too great. And basically, film back in the old days, a film had like a low ISO film had between 1 and 2 stops of latitude, maybe 3. I mean, Ansel Adams was getting like 4 and stuff like this with like custom materials and whatnot. But on digital cameras, we have between 1 and 3 as well. So if this gap here is within 1 and 3, then you could do those on screen or the post-processing GND. Okay. So you just have to, so to answer your question, you just have to, you know, anticipate if the gap is going to be too much or not. And typically when we're shooting sunsets, it's just way too much. So therefore we need to have the GNDs to bridge that gap to get it closer. Yeah, very important. William asked about exposure simulation. So exposure simulation is important because of this reason right here. So if you have, most of you guys have Canons, Nikons, or Sonys, right? So if you have a Canon or a Nikon, follow along right now, because this is what it looks like when you look through the viewfinder with no ND filter at all, okay? When you put on a ND filter, this is what it looks like if exposure simulation is turned on, okay? When you turn exposure simulation off, it looks like this. So in short, you have to go and you have to go into your Canon camera settings and turn off exposure simulation. Okay, Gary asked about prefer zoom lenses or prime lenses. Yeah, I use both. I have I just got the Sigma Art 24, very sharp, very nice lens. But I'll tell you what, this Canon 16 and 35 f4 IS, I think it's one of the sharpest lenses I've ever used. And I'm not saying this because I like Canon. I don't. I'm not, in or out of any particular system. I just like what's best. But in short, to answer your question, the zoom lenses are getting that much better because they're having to make them adapt to these 50 megapixel sensors. I think that's the primary drive to make these lenses better. But again, in order to kind of hack your way to get the best lens, you got to look for those lenses that are designed for these 50 megapixel sensors, because these lens designers are designing them with those specs in mind. Okay, Chris asked, he has a Nikon 5200. Is he out of luck with this process? If you haven't, the only thing that you lack, so if you guys have a crop sensor camera, for those of you guys who have a crop sensor camera, if you kind of raise your hand virtually, you guys, if you guys have a crop sensor, you lack the ISO 50, and you also lack the ability to go really wide, okay? And these two things, being able to double the exposure time and being able to have really wide angle lenses, well, for long exposure, those are really important. For shooting kids and birthdays and weddings and stuff, it's not so important. But for our purpose, for long exposure landscape photography, going really wide and going really long in the exposure is key. And so, yeah, full frame might be better technically or hypothetically, but for us, just the practical being able to go wider and go longer in the exposure is what makes the full frame so much better. And so for those of you guys who are wondering, I wonder if I have the right camera system, just get the Sony A7 camera and get that lens for $1,000. I mean, it's not that much. It's only $999 now. That's it. So basically, just sell your stuff and get this stuff, and then you're just good to go. Because, and I'm not a proponent of any camera system, but I want to make sure that you guys have the tools that you need to make the exposure long enough and be able to go wide enough. And then you guys are at least set to start making images. Okay, very important. Yeah. So Trey asked a very important question. Do I recommend circular reverse ND filters or circular G&Ds, I think is what he's asking. Circular G&Ds, they don't work because you need to be able to adjust the G&D up and down to compensate for the dynamic range. So in other words, if you had a circular ND over the lens, you would literally have to move the camera up and down. But now you're moving the composition. So why would people make that? Well, companies like Tiffin and all these other guys, they make them because they make them, and people buy them because they're available, not because they make sense. So don't go buy, and they're also really cheap. So people, unsuspecting photographers, don't know that they can't move it independently, and so that's why those exist. So in other words, don't do that. Don't use the circular G&Ds. So Shauna's asked if we've added seals to either the square NDs or to the holder to prevent light leak for the square filter holder. Yeah, so we have. And actually, believe it or not, it's funny how manufacturing works, because the really small things take forever and the really big things sometimes come in like a flash of insight. But these damn seals and gaskets took, I think, 4 or 5 months to get the right gaskets. And so we finally settled on this really high quality 3M gasket. And nobody's ever really done what we've done here with these filters with the G&Ds, or sorry, with the square NDs, which is put really high quality coatings on them, like nano coatings. And in doing so, basically anything that gets onto the surface comes off easily. And that even includes gaskets. So then, got these gaskets on the nano coating and it would just peel right off. And so it took forever to get the gaskets just right. And finally we found one that's like a super adhesive. And so, yeah, to answer your question, the square filters have gaskets and they work great. But still, circular filters have 0% light leak. And yeah, we can eliminate most of the light leak with square filters, but still there's this aspect of it not being quite as solid and sturdy. And so that's why, just as a photographer, I recommend that people just start with circular and kind of go from there. If you like square, then that's good too. There's there's pros and cons to both. I mean, squares, I use square as well sometimes. It's very easy to get them in and out. And I probably should have talked about this, but the pros and cons between square and circular. And the squares are really great because you can use them on any lens, which is really great. And they're really versatile in that way. And they're very easy to get in and out very quickly. Whereas the circular filters, they just take, it takes a lot more work to get them on and off and more time as well. So there's pros and cons to both. Shauna, to answer your question, yeah, we've added gaskets. We haven't added gaskets to the holder because if these two gaskets come into contact with each other, they rub each other off. So we've extended the gasket distance on the filter itself to basically come into contact with the holder. So there's no reason to put the gasket on the holder itself. So yeah, so basically, let me tell you guys what my email is, graham@breakthroughfilters.com. So you guys can send me an email. And also, I run a meetup group in San Francisco, and I've been so busy manufacturing that and designing stuff, and I have so much stuff going on that I haven't been able to do as many meetups. But click on this link. If you're ever in the San Francisco area, and actually Darren is doing one of these meetups in a couple days, and Darren he's been doing this stuff for such a long time, and he's such a great guy. Basically what we do is we go out and we do long exposure stuff all as a big group. Sometimes we have 70 people. One time we went to Death Valley. One time I took everyone to Yosemite. I'm trying to put something on the schedule to go back to Death Valley. If I charge anything, we'll just donate it all. And, it's just a great meetup group, and it's focused on landscape and long exposure. So make sure to bookmark that or actually just sign up for it. And even if you're not in the San Francisco Bay Area, when I post meetups in the national parks, you guys can fly out to them. So definitely check that out. And there's a whole bunch of people on this that are in the meetup group. So thank you guys for being here. That's awesome. Thank you guys. And it's good to see you guys again, even if it's just virtually. So yeah, that's about it though. And I'm glad that you guys came. And I know that there's probably a lot of questions that I didn't answer, but I hope that I answered a lot of the basics. Filling in the gaps here on the equipment is really critical, and knowing which filters to have and which filters not to have. And, to be honest with you guys, and I said this already, but I really think you just need 3 filters, okay? Maybe you have them. If you don't, write this down. You just need a 6-stop circular or square, and a 2-stop soft, and a 3-stop hard reverse. And that's going to get you started on the road to shooting long exposure photography. And as long as you're within those exposure parameters, again, they're in the 2 to 4 minutes between f14 and f20 for the optimal sharpness. Really, the game just becomes moving your physical body around and composition. And really where you want to be is you just want to be able to get you just want to get into a situation where you're focusing on composition and not equipment. And it's so tedious getting over the equipment learning curve, but when you do it, it just clicks. And so in any case, if you guys have any other questions, shoot me an email. And I know that you guys asked me for the slides. So for those of you guys who want the slides, please send me an email and I will reply with the PDF. So my email is graham@breakthroughfilters.com. It was a pleasure having all of you guys here. And I hope to do another one of these in the future, not the same content, but in addition to this, because there's a lot of stuff I couldn't cover. So I'll send you guys an email, if that's okay, about this particular one. Since you guys have joined this, it'll be related to this. And I hope to see you guys next time. So thank you all for being here, and see you guys next time.